You are listening to Labor Pains, an Injured Worker podcast featuring conversations in workers' compensation and health and safety in Ontario, Canada, and beyond. Labor Pains is produced by Injured Workers Community Legal Clinic and is not a substitute for legal advice. For more information on workers' compensation issues, campaigns, and resources, visit injuredworkersonline.org. Today's episode is hosted by Tabassum Durrani, a lawyer at Injured Workers Community Legal Aid Clinic.
Occupational diseases in the context of workers' compensation can seem somewhat invisible. Unlike a traumatic injury, these illnesses often develop slowly, after years of breathing toxic dust, handling hazardous chemicals, or working in environments that can damage the body over time. And for many workers, by the time symptoms appear, proving that their illness was caused by work becomes an uphill battle. On today's episode, we're speaking with Janice Martell, one of Ontario's leading advocates for workers suffering from occupational disease. Through her groundbreaking work documenting the harms of McIntyre Powder exposure in miners, and now her advocacy around sarcoidosis and other emerging occupational illnesses, Janice has helped expose the gaps in how the WSIB recognizes or fails to recognize diseases caused by workplace exposure. Janice's new registry is a worker-led initiative designed to document cases of sarcoidosis and other potentially work-related illnesses among miners and exposed workers, with the goal of identifying patterns of occupational disease that have historically gone unrecognized by compensation systems. This conversation is more than just about one illness. It's about who gets believed and what happens when workers are forced to fight not only for their health, but for recognition that their work made them sick in the first place.
Thanks very much for joining me, Janice, to talk about your advocacy work. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really important, and your work is too.
Thank you. So you've spent over a decade advocating for workers impacted by occupational disease. Can you tell our listeners what compelled you to take on this work?
For sure. So my father, his name is Jim Hobbs. He was an underground miner in both Sudbury and in the Elliott Lake uranium mines. And in when the mines closed down in 1990, about 10 years after that, he started having symptoms of Parkinson's. He started having little shaking in his fingers and eventually in his arms and elsewhere, having difficulty with his balance. And he was eventually diagnosed in February of 2001 with Parkinson's. But it wasn't until 10 years after that he disclosed that he had been exposed to something that I had never heard of before in the uranium mines. And it was aluminum dust, finely ground aluminum dust that workers were mandated by their employers to inhale as a medical treatment against the lung disease silicosis. The theory was that if you inhaled this finely ground aluminum dust into your lungs, it would coat the lungs, prevent the respirable crystalline silica molecule. So when you break apart rock in mining activities, some different kinds of ore bodies and natural rock formations have higher contents of silica, which is in its tiny form has very sharp edges, so it can get into your lungs and cause scarring. And make it very difficult for your lungs. You know, your lungs are elastic; they're meant to expand and contract as you breathe in and out, and it can make it very difficult for workers to breathe who have inhaled this. So there's higher silica content generally in gold and uranium mines than there is in nickel and copper mines. So he never experienced this when he was in Sudbury, in the nickel and copper mines in Sudbury. But when he went to Elliott Lake in 1978, he was required. He walked into a room every day before work, and there was long benches on either side of this room, and they would sit there, and these little canisters of ground up aluminum were put into a compressed air system. So they were punctured and put into a compressed air system. And this aluminum, this really, really finely ground aluminum would be dispersed in this dust cloud. And workers would have to sit there for about 10 minutes or so before going underground for their shift every day. And I knew nothing about it until 2011 when somebody had mentioned to my mom something about this aluminum, and I had represented my mom years ago. She was a receptionist at a medical clinic, and she had had a shoulder injury from, constantly pulling files in and off of shelves. And I had represented her for a workers' compensation claim. So she came to me and said, "Hey, somebody mentioned something about aluminum dust." I talked to Dad about it, and right away he said, "McIntyre powder." And I was horrified. I was horrified. What is McIntyre powder? What are you talking about? It has a name, this name. It was just mind-blowing to me that anyone would inhale a metal. I can't think that that would be good for your lungs. Any dust is not good for your lungs. We had wildfires here in Canada the last several years with climate change. And, they tell us to stay indoors. The air quality is no good. Well, these guys are putting regular mine dust into their lungs and into their bodies just from regular mining activities, and then there's this extra layer added on top of it. So I became my dad's representative on a workers' compensation claim in 2011 for his Parkinson's, and because I did a little bit of online research, and it looked like heavy metals and stuff could be associated and that kind of stuff, and it was denied and denied again when we objected. And we were at the point in 2014 when we were going to be at the tribunal level where we would have to, appeal to the tribunal. And I put in the appeal, notice that we were going to be making the appeal. But as I was doing the research, I was way over my head, and I knew that. But, I was Dad's help and hope. So, I talked to him about it. He had no faith that it would go anywhere because, he felt workers' comp was rigged or just against the worker at least. And he said, just forget it, just withdraw the claim. So, I at that point felt quite helpless because, when you have somebody that you love going through a neurodegenerative disease that is, uh, you know, it's it's going to continue. There's no good end to that. There's nothing you can do to stop that. And I thought this is one thing I can do. I can fight, right? Um, so we withdrew the claim, but I asked Dad's permission, his consent to tell his story more publicly and to try and see how many other workers out there who were exposed to this were also suffering health issues, and was Parkinson's one of them? Were there other things going on? So he gave his blessing, which I thought was one of the bravest things that he did, because he is a strong, very, very proud private man. And he wouldn't want anyone to know that he was struggling. And he allowed me to tell his story because, uh, he could see the passion with me, and that I'm a fighter when it comes to, I'll put up with a lot of stuff for myself. Um, but when I'm done, I'm done. But if you hurt somebody that I love, I am fierce, and I will I will fight for them and get those answers. Um, so I thought, well, I got to try. So he gave his blessing. The WSIB, one of the things that made us really kind of pull back from his claim was they had this policy that they had in place um, for, well, at that point, I think it was 1997 when they developed the policy, and had it in place until 2017. But it was their only negative entitlement policy. So in their history, still, it was the only policy that basically directed a case manager or a claims adjudicator to deny a claim. And the policy was occupational aluminum exposure and neurodegenerative diseases. And, several years down the road, I found out through a WSIB Freedom of Information request that that policy was specifically developed because a worker had won their claim in 1996 at the Workplace Compensation Appeals Tribunal, which is now known as WSIAT, the Workplace Safety and Insurance Appeals Tribunal. It was an electrical worker, I believe, and he had it wasn't McIntyre powder exposure, but it was other aluminum exposure through his work, and he won his claim. And the WSAB, in response, they developed this policy. They developed this policy that said uh, automatically deny the claim, so you couldn't win. And I thought, the WSAB, they have full control. When I started researching for Dad's claim, I read the Workplace Safety and Insurance Appeals Workplace Safety and Insurance Act, and just tried to understand how they make decisions, how they operate. And it really hit me that they are an entity unto themselves. They set what are the rules, what are the policies, which diseases become legislated occupational diseases through their legislative schedule, the regulatory schedules, Schedule 3, which is a rebuttable presumption occupational disease. You're exposed to this stuff at work. We're going to presume that you got this disease from your work if you're, those kinds of automatic presumptions. And then Schedule 4, where it's non-rebuttable, something like a asbestos related lung diseases like mesothelioma. Well, we know that asbestos causes mesothelioma. There's no question. If you were exposed to asbestos at work and you later developed mesothelioma, we're going to presume that your work caused that.
Right.
And and beyond, after the schedules, it's policies that they develop, and those policies are binding. It's the next thing. You're supposed to look at this individual case and figure out what they were exposed to, if that caused their occupational disease. But really, if they have a policy, they just apply the policy, and they have these guideline that are less than policy, but they're applied like policies. They do these adjudicative support documents and adjudicative support guidelines. They apply them like policy all of the time. And so I thought, well, I need to go outside of this system. I can't just expect that individual workers, even a cluster of individual workers, a bunch of them all, exposed to McIntyre powder or having other common exposures, all applying to the WSAB. Well, are they keeping track of those? Are they saying, wow, we're seeing a real trend here in, did other workers who were exposed to this, who ended up with Parkinson's or other health issues, did they make that connection? Because to me, I thought there's something here. I worked as an addiction counselor at that time, and I remember, learning about different routes to the body of where different, drugs can enter. And one of the quickest routes to the brain is snorting, which is why you see people snort, cocaine or grind up Percocet and different things like that. And I thought, well, if they're breathing this in, some of it's going up the nose, and there's an olfactory pathway to the brain. And I didn't know. I thought, well, is maybe the aluminum dust, if they ground it that fine, would have a chance to make it up to the brain through the blood-brain barrier and get into Dad's brain and maybe cause his Parkinson's. I think it's a valid question. The problem was that nobody was asking that question, and nobody was really trying to seek out those answers. So I thought, well, I'm gonna do something different here, and I created a voluntary registry for the McIntyre. I called it the McIntyre Powder Project, which is still going, and I still have people registering with that. And it's just like, quite frankly, it's a body count. You're counting how many people were exposed to something and got sick, or worked in a certain workplace and got sick, and what kinds of health issues they had. So we had one common exposure and then multiple health outcomes. So I just put it out there to people publicly. Thank goodness, journalists were very interested in this and equally horrified that this had ever happened to workers. And there were 27,500 workers in Ontario alone who were exposed to McIntyre powder. This
Wow.
program ran from 1943 to 1979 every day. And it was really journalism that stopped this program in its track. The Toronto Star and Fifth Estate did a joint investigation, and in September of 1979, they broadcast and published their concerns, and that, of course, led to panic at the Ministry of Labor, and the Minister of Labor got involved, and, ordered a scientific task force to look into this, and the scientific task force came back somewhat diplomatically and said, well, we don't think it causes harm, but we don't think that anybody should have to be involuntarily exposed to it. And once that became a choice to the workers, they were like, we're out,
Right.
no, we're not, we don't want this. And it shut down very quickly. So yeah, it was uh, a long exposure period. And because it was developed at McIntyre Mine in Schumacher, Ontario, in the Timmins mining camp, they named it McIntyre Powder. And even though Ontario was the largest cohort of workers who were exposed to this went worldwide. This was down in the States. This was over in Australia, Mexico, Chile, Belgian Congo. There was a trial at a Givor tin mine in England, and they rejected it. After that, there was other countries who rejected it, but this went across Canada. It wasn't just Ontario. Several provinces in Canada. Quebec, there was a lot of, especially the Val-d'Or region, the gold mining region there out in BC, some limited places of uranium mines out in like the Saskatchewan Northwest Territory area, Manitoba, there was a couple of places there. So it's, there were a lot of workers affected, and they were affected a long time ago. So how do you even find these workers?
Right.
Yeah, so for me, I was living in Elliott Lake at the time, and that's an ex-mining community, right? A former mining community. So I just, I got a table at a grocery store and, sat there and had little, I wrote up a one pager of, hey, this is what's happening with my dad, and did this happen to any of you? And um, are you willing to give me your, I basically take somebody's name, and then whatever information they're comfortable giving me. I realize I'm a nobody. I'm not a health, a health agency or anything like that. But I usually take name, date of birth, date of death if it's a deceased worker and it's their next of kin, registering them. And then, their basic work history, finding out where they worked and when approximately. Part of that was to verify McIntyre powder exposure. And then what health issues did they end up with? And many of them had symptoms and no diagnoses. And others had very clear diagnosed health conditions. Always in mining, respiratory is a big one, right? Because you're underground, you're not getting adequate fresh air from the ventilation system. You're in a bunch of rock dusts, mining dust, blasting fumes, drill oil mist. So when you're drilling, you have to keep the drills cool enough and lubricated enough. So you have all that as you're drilling, and these, vibrating tools, you have all that blowing back in your face and inhaling it. And it has all kinds of horrific, toxic ingredients. Diesel exhaust. Diesel exhaust is massive. The silica dust is massive. Silica dust is the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC. They have classifications of known human carcinogens, and Group 1 is a known human carcinogen. Silica dust. Silica is one of them. Respirable crystalline silica is a carcinogen. Diesel exhaust is a carcinogen. Some of the other things, that arsenic and some of the things used to process, a lot of the workers in the mine mills would be exposed to horrific stuff, cyanide and arsenic and acid mist and different things like that are cause innumerable health issues. Um, so yeah, I wanted to find out if there are trends. And let me tell you, as soon as you start asking a bunch of workers, what are you okay? Are you okay? That's a pretty fundamental question. And we don't have that happening in our world, certainly not in Ontario. We are not asking workers, are you okay? And not just the workers who are at work, who might be getting screened, who might be getting, chest x-rays to see if the dust and the other stuff that they're exposed to are hurting them, or blood tests, which you see in a lot of places where there's chemical exposures. Um, but sick workers aren't at work to do those. Sick workers aren't there at work to monitor. Retired workers are not at work to monitor. People, when you have a job like mining or construction or other, they can be very transient jobs. You're at this job site, and some of our trade workers, our Red Seal skilled workers, they're just going. They have multiple employers. They could be across Canada. They could be across the world. They may have their trade union based here in Ontario or somewhere else. But they are going everywhere. They're going where the jobs are, right? And so you may not have that same, work crew for 30 years that's going to notice when you're not at work and is going to ask, are you okay? But there is a massive, massive disconnect, and it's a huge problem between the workers, what they're exposed to, what their health outcomes are, and then the policymakers, the researchers. How do the researchers know where to look unless you're starting to do that general mapping, which is what I'm doing with my registry. I'm
Right.
doing that general lay of the land.
Right. And so you're now focusing on sarcoidosis in minors, I understand,
Yes.
and applying the same
Yeah.
methodology. And can you walk us through what put that on your radar um, at this point, and what sort of evidence, I guess, is challenging the assumption that this disease, doesn't have a particular cause?
For sure. So the McIntyre Powder Project Voluntary Registry is what first introduced me to sarcoidosis. I had never heard of it before. I didn't know what it was. Um, it is basically it's not an autoimmune disease, but it's an immune mediated disease. So your immune system reacts to something, and instead of, antibodies, it's immune cells themselves that start clumping up into lumps called granulomas in your body. And pulmonary sarcoidosis is one of the most common forms. So involving your lungs and lymph nodes are usually it's a big part of it, but it can really affect many, many parts of your body. So your skin, your eyes, your heart, so cardiac sarcoidosis. And it can be quite debilitating, particularly if you have like the initial flare up can be quite debilitating. Um, and, steroid treatments and stuff like that can be long and high doses of steroids. Some people have milder cases. So you think of somebody like a lot of the autoimmune or allergic type of those kinds of health concerns can affect different people differently. Some people, it's not like you have to be exposed to this much silica dust before sarcoidosis is going to kick in. If you are an individual who might have more susceptibility to those kinds of um, health issues and those kinds of exposures, you may develop a case at a very lower exposures. We see that in other like multiple chemical sensitivity, like people, just I think about children in school with peanut butter. Some kids can eat a jar full of peanut butter, no problem, and some can't even be around the smell of it, having any kind of airborne, and they're sensitive to it. So I had 15 people on my voluntary registry. Um, who reported having a diagnosis of sarcoidosis. And it's not easy. It's not an easy disease to diagnose because it's usually biopsy that requires that. And that can be quite tricky when you're going into lungs or spleen or wherever this sarcoidosis can pop up, liver, different areas and organs of the body. But 15 of them are reporting that. And it's a very rare granulomatous disease. And I thought there's something here, right? And through my McIntyre Powder project work, I changed employers. I'm no longer a counselor, and I've been working for the last 10 years for the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers, or OCOW. So they took on the McIntyre Powder group. My voluntary registry has 717 workers on it right now to date, since I launched it in April of 2015. And OCOW, there's about around 560 or so who fully registered with OCOW. We probably had over 600 who, initially came forward, but not all of them followed through. And in amongst the OCOW group, we have, there's OCOW has contract physicians, and we have occupational hygienists, ergonomists, nurses, like people who can look at a worker's um, health issues and look at what the clinical literature says and what the medical literature says, and give some opinion back, and uh, occupational expertise back to say, okay, we think this is work related, and here's why. Here's why, flipping burgers for 40 years maybe causes some risk issues, or working around certain toxic elements is causing your lung issues or your cancer, and things like that. So they looked at the group that they had of sarcoidosis cases, and they had, I think there was about 15 as well, not the same 15, some overlap. And they had 12, basically either definite or probable cases. So biopsy proven sarcoidosis cases. And they wrote a case series about that. And all 12 of them, we helped to make claims for workers' compensation. We helped them to fill out the initial paperwork. And some of them had previously made claims in, back in 1980s, 1970, whenever they were exposed, had their initial diagnosis of sarcoidosis. All of them. So we put those in for help the workers to ask for reconsideration on those claims. All 12 of them were denied. One estate subsequently dropped out because they just said it's just too emotionally hard to deal with WSIB, and to deal with, you bring up these issues, and watching their father get quite ill, and die, and then they're like, we just can't handle this. So of the 11 left, OCOW was completed occupational hygiene reports and medical consultant review on their sarcoidosis, really specifically looking at, they did a literature review and looked at what kinds of workplace exposures can be related to sarcoidosis. And one of them is silica. And silica exposure, all of them would have had silica exposure. Some metals are suspected of being involved. One of the outbreaks of sarcoidosis cases was after the World Trade Center, after 9/11. There were a number of workers who worked on the dust pile and the rubble pile who ended up with sarcoidosis. And, they would have been a mixture of a bunch of toxic dust, but one of them would have been silica as well, which you see in building materials and cements and that kind of thing. So there those cases were going to be appealed. And unfortunately, in February, mid-February, the worker representative, the legal representative that was going to represent them for the appeal, decided to close their file. They decided that they were not going to proceed. And frankly, I was was pissed off. I was angry that we'd done all this work and there's something there. Like they're one of the out of the OCAL literature reviews that came to light was that it is anticipated that 30% of of uh, sarcoidosis cases are related to occupation and occupational exposures. And in Ontario, to our knowledge, there has been no successful sarcoidosis claim, certainly not at the tribunal. And Dr. Christine Oliver, who is she's a lung disease, occupational lung disease expert. She's incredible. And when she was looking at these cases, she's done expert witness testimony across. She came from the United States, and she's done expert witness testimony on these kinds of issues around the states. And a worker, I believe it was a construction worker out in British Columbia, was going to their compensation appeals tribunal and had asked Dr. Oliver to review his case and to write a report, which she did, and that claim was accepted on appeal. What's the difference in Ontario? There was a different expert that was used. There was a recent, fairly recent, I think 2024, sarcoidosis case that was denied at the Workplace Safety and Insurance Appeals Tribunal, and they relied on the expert review of a different doctor. I think that with Dr. Oliver and her understanding and her expertise, these cases would stand a really good chance at the tribunal. And when the legal rep, walked away, I thought, no, I'm not okay with this. And I thought, well, okay, if I'm gonna, if I wanted to help understand if my dad's Parkinson's was related to McIntyre Powder, I needed to help all of the McIntyre Powder guys who wanted my help. And I've been doing that, and will continue to do that as long as I live, as long as I can, and as long as I'm capable. I thought I'm going to do the same thing for these guys on my voluntary registry and with OCAL, who have sarcoidosis and their claims are, dead in the water right now. They're still ready to appeal.
Right.
So on March 10th, I did a little open letter video to the workers of Ontario, and I said, look, I don't care what industry you're in, if you worked in Ontario and you later developed sarcoidosis and you'd like to join my sarcoidosis voluntary registry, it's open. I had an old cell phone because I had upgraded. I went down to TELUS and got them to do a talk and text on it so that I could have a dedicated phone line for that. And anyone across who's ever worked in Ontario, whoever ended up with sarcoidosis can call me and we can talk. And if they want to add their name to my voluntary registry, we'll do that. So unlike McIntyre powder, where you have one exposure and multiple health outcomes, I'm looking at one common health outcome, sarcoidosis. What are their exposures? What can we learn from this? Because if 30% of sarcoidosis cases come from your occupation and 0% of them are being accepted at the Ontario WSIB and Ontario WSIAT, what the hell? There's something going on there.
Yeah, and that's a question I've had about, from your perspective, why has it been so difficult for workers with diseases like sarcoidosis to have their conditions accepted as work-related? Is it just a gap in the research? What's your take?
For sure. And I think with rarer diseases, like we also found a group of ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis cases amongst that. And, and I think with rarer diseases, it's difficult to achieve statistical significance when you do to have enough people to look at. And that statistical significance and the number of studies done, make it easier for the WSIB to look at and say, well, we don't have consistent evidence. But, 12 or 15 workers working in the same industry, all getting the same rare disease, that is evidence. That is evidence. Their bodies, their diseases are evidence. And interestingly enough, when uh, I didn't expect, when I first started my McIntyre Powder project volunteer registry, there were like 5 people on it, and you'd go to an event, and that, I think that's really important too, because when I talk about that disconnect between the worker and the people in power who are making decisions about workers or doing research about workers, if you look at it, whatever, your grade 6, grade 2 science experiment, whatever, the first thing you do is observe, right? You are looking for something, you have a theory. Well, you can't do a science experiment on, the behavior of lions if you're not observing lions and seeing what their behavior is like. You can't do adequate, fulsome research on worker health if you're not asking the workers what their health issues are and seeing that. Um, Workers in the kinds of industries that tend to have higher rates of work-related diseases, um, you know, you're going to reach them by going to their communities and being out in the public where they want to take measure of you. They want to know who you are. They don't trust, and I don't blame them for not trusting. I don't blame them for not trusting workers' comp. I don't blame them. There's been issues sometimes with people who are supposed to help them and don't. And they're very much, kind of, there's a culture of very much you work hard, you do what needs doing, you don't complain, and you put up with stuff. And they may not know. Like, if you look in Ontario, how many physical WSIB offices are there left? I checked it out, and my understanding is there are 4 left, and they're all in Southern Ontario. So you have the Sudbury physical office is closed, the Timmins physical office is closed, the North Bay physical office is closed, the Thunder Bay physical office is closed. How are workers supposed to know even where to go? I'm getting calls from miners. I'm getting calls from non-Ontarians. I'm getting calls from not because of my McIntyre Powder project reputation, and people are just looking for help. They don't know where to go. WSIB wants everything online now. They even took their uh, the WSIB Form 6, the Workers' Report of Injury or Disease. They took that PDF offline. So you can't, if you go to WSIB and ask for that, you can't find it. Thank God my former union, OPSU, they have it online, so you can get it from them. Um, but they're just making it harder and harder, in my view, for workers to even know where to go. Like the uranium miners in Elliott Lake. Well, the uranium mines have been closed since the last one closed in 1996. Where do you go if you end up with something? The Office of the Worker Advisor in Elliott Lake, that office is closed when that worker who was there retired. So they don't know where to go. They don't know how to get help. So you call the WSAB, and it's, you have your intake workers, and it's a crapshoot. Some of them are amazing, some of them not so much. And for some of these workers to go online, they don't know how to use the computer. They don't have email. Some of them do. Great. That's a fraction. That's a fraction. The people that I work with, McIntyre Powder was used decades ago. So I work with 70 and 80 and 90-year-olds and 60-year-olds. But they're not, by and large, computer literate. They don't have printers. They don't have scanners that you can sign forms. They don't know how. They need help. They need help. And that service just is not there. It's just not there. And so I get calls from people for all kinds of stuff. Um, you know, uh, People outside of the mining industry and stuff, they've got a health issue. They're looking something up, and they see me, and they're like, I need, at least she'll talk to me. And I think that we need to, there should be in whatever, put a kiosk in a shopping mall like they have with Service Ontario. Do it for WSIB. You can
Right.
come in here, sit down. You know, some of my guys went into mining because they have literacy issues. They to type something out or to write something out, they struggle with that. There might be language barriers. You can have a kiosk in a mall or somewhere out that is accessible in the community for workers to go and sit down with somebody face to face, and you would see a lot more claims. You would. I've personally, outside of OCal, outside of because I do my McIntyre Powder project work on a voluntary basis outside of OCal. It obviously overlaps with because there's a group, the McIntyre Powder group within OCal. But outside of OCal, I've helped like 100 or more people fill out the initial paperwork because that Form 6 is not easy to fill out. It is designed to report injury or illness, but it's really injury. Because they talk about, well, what date and time did the injury occur, or were you aware of your illness? Who's going to know exactly the date and time that they were aware that they had, lung cancer symptoms or whatever? Like it's just, who was your supervisor? Well, I don't know. I worked 40 years ago. And I don't remember that, or it's the estate applying. They don't have the answers to those things. So they just need guidance. They just need help. And I do a lot of what I do now is just as a resource for people to say, okay, the your physician's records probably don't exist after 10 years of you dying or of your last visit there, or that physician is retired or died because, again, we're talking back 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s of these guys being exposed to McIntyre powder. Hospital records may last longer, but you may not even have the medical records to be able to confirm a diagnosis. Uh, those are challenges. Somebody dies and they don't have a will. Those are challenges to, who gets the right to be the estate rep. And I'm not a legal expert. I'm not a medical expert. I'm not a compensation expert, but I have learned a lot from what I, helping people, just going out and talking to them, that can be a resource and help them to navigate the system a little bit.
And so it, like, from what you're describing, it feels like there's a real under recognition of occupational disease broadly in Ontario. Would you say that we're seeing just sort of the tip of the iceberg?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Like we're not even close to it. One of when I first, the USW Local 6500 worker rep at that time when I started this was JP Marachuk. And he said, of his accepted claims, and you know how difficult it can be for a claim to be accepted,
Right.
but it was 16 times more for occupational disease and occupational injury that he had, and there's so many more out there. Like since I started the McIntyre Powder project and started voluntary registry and OCal, got involved, and the USW were instrumental in helping us with those intake clinics and reaching out to members and volunteering at the clinics. But since that time, they've had to erect a new section of the Elliott Lake Miners Memorial Wall because that's how many more names are going on there. There's 11 names going on this year. And, you think about that. It was 1996 was the last time that a uranium mine was even operating in Elliott Lake. And in Elliott Lake, unlike most mining memorials that I've seen, most of them recognize fatal accidents, right? You died of an accident at work. Occupational disease kills vastly more people than does accidents at work. And I put air quotes over accidents because most accidents are preventable.
Right.
But
So, yeah.
but lots of
Sorry,
occupational disease is
yeah.
preventable too if
Yeah.
you know. Yeah. So,
So you
yeah,
talked
they had
about
to erect a
some.
new piece on there, and 10 of the 11 that are going on this year, names that are going on are McIntyre Powder miners.
Well,
Yeah.
you talked about some like structural barriers to for workers to access information, make claims. In addition to improving, information and access to making a claim and resources, can you explain other types of policy or legislative changes that you think the WSIB has to make to respond to what you're seeing from uh, the experiences of workers that you're assisting?
For sure. I think that the largest thing for WSIB is having oversight, um, and uh, keeping up for occupational diseases anyways, keeping up with the science. Like their policies, they develop a policy and then it's just like, okay, we're done that. You know, I think it's 2003 maybe that they did this guidance document, adjudicative advice document on chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is probably the biggest respiratory disease that I have on my voluntary registry. Um, and it says that, for that workers had to have been exposed to 40 to 50 milligrams per cubic meter years of dust exposure, respirable dust exposure, in order for the WSIB to consider their COPD work related. The science is nowhere near that. It's so much lower. And you have to consider other types of things, fumes and vapors and gases and other things apart from just dusts that cause COPD. And it's infuriating. Oh, it's not policy. We don't, we when it's not policy, we look at the merits and justice of the case. Well, they don't. They apply these guidelines, and they developed a guideline for sarcoidosis. And WSAB is digging in their heels there. They are digging in their heels on this one. I don't know if they're seeing other claims from other workers. Silica is not just unique to mining. Construction workers, engineered stone workers are at high exposures of silica. I'm actually attending a Workplace Health Without Borders webinar today around uh, engineered stone workers in Australia and how they've banned the use of engineered stone unless the silica content is, I think it's less than 1% or something like that. Whereas it was like uh, way up. Like I want to say 90% or something. It was a crazy high amount of silica in engineered stone. Um, and when I launched the sarcoidosis volunteer registry, I actually heard from a torts lawyer down in California who said that they have engineered stone workers that have like silicosis and those kinds of diseases, but they're also seeing sarcoidosis in those workers. So I think that there's something there. The WCB just needs to have we need to have some sort of system that's an external, apart from just the tribunal. The tribunal it's great that we have somewhere that we can make um, that we can refer cases to for a second set of eyes. But the WSIB, the legislation allows the WSIB to write policies that the tribunal can then not overturn. So when they write a policy like the one that barred my dad and anybody else with Parkinson's or neurological disorders to claim for the aluminum McIntyre powder exposure, um, there are other policies that they put in place that I think it's Section 161 of the Act. That seems to stand out in my mind. But the tribunal cannot overturn a WSIB decision that was made in accordance with the WSIB's own policies, and those policies are written by the WSIB. So that's when I'm talking them being an entity unto themselves. We need to break through that, and the only way to break through that right now, in my mind, is to do the kinds of things that I'm doing, which is to go outside of the system. Okay, that's great that you're whatever, you can deny these claims or whatever. Well, let's see how many people actually have sarcoidosis. Let's see where they work. And some very interesting things have come up. It's there's a pulp and paper mill that is now closed in the town where I was born, actually, and went to high school. And one worker registered with me, but I am aware of three other workers at that same mill who all had sarcoidosis. And I heard from another person who joined the volunteer registry and told me that I could speak about this. She worked down in Hamilton at a chemical company. It was Procter and Gamble, and she said she said there was about 800 workers there, and amongst just the group of workers that she knew, there were six of them, her included, with sarcoidosis. That's not nothing. Something's going on there. And she said they made, there was different soaps and shampoos and chemicals and different things like that. And they looked at, depending on which area of the plant you worked in, you could not have certain exposures and some of others. And then sometimes where you worked, you were getting whatever, right? Because it's through the ventilation system and whatever. And they had all been exposed to one abrasive cleanser that did have silica in it too. So it's really piquing my curiosity, my non-scientific curiosity brain of like, okay, there's something here, and I want to know what this is, and did some of that stuff get emitted out into the smokestack and affect others in the community? Because I'm also aware of two other people, one of them who joined my sarcoidosis volunteer registry, who lived in that community, who didn't work at the mill, who
Oh,
have sarcoidosis. So what's going on there? Is there something that's being pumped out? So it's I think I'm curious about that. And if we can, when you gather workers together and gather their health issues together, you start to see trends. Sarcoidosis was one of them, ALS was one of them, Parkinson's was one of them. And that informs researchers, hey, you might want to look at this. Is there something going on here? And like, I'm not an expert. I don't know what's in certain chemicals and stuff like that. And there's some information we'll never know what was in certain chemicals that were used back in the 40s or 50s or whatever. Um, but I can ask the question and provide that to people who do have, some expertise and can look into it. Like that's what I'm doing. It's just observing, mapping, gathering data, and then saying, hey, why are there 6+ workers at, a soap manufacturing and chemical manufacturing plant with sarcoidosis? Why are there four or four more in a pulp and paper mill? What's going on? Yeah, so I've connected as well with the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, and OCAU's connected with them, and they're quite interested in this as well. And they have a lot of expertise, and they're saying that they think it might not be as rare as we think, but it's just so difficult to diagnose that that might be the issue. So.
on that note, from your perspective, what role should that kind of like independent scientific research play in shaping compensation policy? You spoke of a gap and a lack of responsiveness, it seems, in cases where there may be some research. So I'm wondering if you can just speak to that, because I know you're not a scientific researcher, but it
No,
sounds like
no,
a lot
absolutely.
of work
Well,
with them.
I think that we need to build in the mechanisms and the infrastructure for researchers to inform and bind the compensation board, so that it's not just, okay, we've done a research and we have this. Then the WSIB can take it and say, oh, okay, well, we'll wait for more research to come along, or we're not quite there yet, or thank you very much, we'll consider implementing, or whatever, and then it just sits there. I mean, you have the Paul Demers report that was done. I think it came out I think it was just before the Occupational Cancer Research Center report that was, I think it was 2019 that he did his report looking at cancers and looking at, the what does the occupational disease landscape look like for cancers in other jurisdictions, looking at the number of cancers in other parts of Canada and other parts of the world that are automatically presumed, if you're exposed to this and you get this cancer later, you know, it's occupationally related. That report, to my knowledge, has just been sitting. Like it just hasn't the what they added a few different poisonings to the schedule. When they added in 2022, January 2022, they added McIntyre powder related Parkinson's as a Schedule 3 occupational disease. It was the first time in 28 years that a new occupational disease had been added to Schedule 3. Like that's crazy. That's crazy. We know that, rubber workers get bladder cancer and uranium miners get lung cancer and gold miners get lung cancer and some stomach cancers and, different things like that. Like, come on, like how much evidence do you need before you're going to say, okay, we're going to give the legal standard is the benefit of the doubt to the worker, and we don't. And it would free up so much time for WSIB claims adjudicators if we just put this, okay, like let's get off the pot here and call this what it is. Um, this is an occupational disease. It would free up their time to work on the more complex ones.
Right. And so from that, you work very closely with a number of workers and have obviously experienced the impacts of having a loved one navigate an occupational injury. Can you speak to the human consequences when these occupational diseases are not recognized socially, financially? What's the impact on the people and the families you support?
It's massive. It's traumatic. Um, the it's not just that occupational diseases don't get recognized. It's that occupational exposures don't get managed. They're we've the case of diesel exhausts underground is so infuriating. We know that it kills workers. We know that it kills workers. Take out your diesel equipment. Take out, go back to electric and I mean, there's concerns with electric too, that there can be fires and stuff like that with the batteries. I get that. And fire in a mine it sucks up all the oxygen, right? It's a death trap. But there are things that we do. We've known for centuries that silica is a problem, that dust related uh, diseases is a problem. And we're not controlling those things because it costs, a lot to provide fresh air to the miners. Like the ventilation costs a lot, the operating cost is a lot, the digging um, the vent shafts and stuff like that. So that's the first level of prevention. But when they do get sick and then you apply for WSIB and you don't get the help that you need, um, workers are left with, family members taking care of them. I can tell you, my mom's own health irrevocably went downhill looking after dad. I mean, with Parkinson's, you fall a lot, and she was his primary caregiver. He didn't have the supports at home that he needed. We did our best. We had, there's 4 kids. We all work full time. My brother-in-law would come down and help. One of his grandchildren was a PSW at the time. She's a nurse now. She would come and help. We would go and help sleep over towards the end when dad was bad. But, for I want to say years after dad died in 2017, mom would, if there was a loud noise, she would just jump because it was that trauma from dad's falling, and he was a strong, solid guy, right? And her trying to help him up on her own when we weren't there was awful. Financially, towards the end, we had to advocate massively on a crisis basis in the last month of my dad's life to get home supports. They wanted to give the typical, okay, well, we'll give you half an hour a day to come and shower him. Okay, well, what about the other 23 and a half hours? Because he would get up in the night multiple times. I stayed over there the one night when I was on night shift with him, and we started keeping a little diary, and it was the highest was 21 times in a night. You would just get him back to bed, and the Parkinson's was wearing on him, and he was starting with the early signs of like dementia, which is often can happen with Parkinson's after years. And he'd forget that he had just gone to bed, or nights and days would get mixed up. He'd get up and go to try and eat something or whatever, and he'd had to go to the bathroom ridiculous amount of times. It was I was exhausted, just exhausted after there. We took him down to a medical appointment, and we got adjoining rooms for the night, my parents and I. And I slept in the adjoining room, and I was so exhausted from looking after him that Dad, Mom switched with me. And I slept in the bed. We had a 2-bedroom, and Dad fell out of the bed, and I was so exhausted I couldn't hear him. That's how impactful it is. And Mom came from the other room to help, and I felt so horribly, but you're just exhausted, and it's traumatic. You know, the WSIB in the past, before 1990, you would get a pension if you were, which was a lot more helpful to help for, and wage replacement and stuff if you couldn't work anymore. And you do get some wage replacement now, but I mean, these diseases happen sometimes long past retirement, and they cut you off at 65, or I think they go 2 years past 65 if you started at 63 or beyond
Yes.
for wage replacement. We had none of that, and now if you'll get a non-economic loss award, and sometimes it can be here's $6,000 for getting Parkinson's, but what you do get is healthcare benefits, and those healthcare benefits can pay for things that the taxpayers would otherwise pay for. So the workers' compensation system is fully funded by employers, and so it's not the taxpayer that costs that has to pay for that. But if workers are not getting compensated for things that are occupationally related, then the taxpayer absolutely pays for that. We're the ones that pay for, to support social assistance programs and the healthcare that they need. So it is impactful as a society. It is impactful, deeply impactful as workers and as their family members. I just finished writing the manuscript for a book on McIntyre Powder, and the miners, focused a lot on the mine workers who were exposed. It's with the publisher now, and it'll be coming out in April of 2027. But in doing that and doing the research and interviewing mine workers and their families, it was very interesting. Chapter 13 is on cost. It was called Cost. It's a 15 chapters. The book is called Dusted the Men of the McIntyre Powder Experiment. And I took one worker from each of the 4 main mining districts in Ontario that used it. So Timmins, Kirkland Lake, Red Lake, and Elliott Lake. And my dad was the Elliott Lake miner. And I did a chapter on them. And then when we talk about the cost, because we talk about liability in chapter 12, where you're talking about, okay, so these mining companies close and who's liable? And then you've got the compensation system. I talk about all of the difficulties with the compensation system. And then chapter 13 was cost. And it's really like looking at who bears the cost of, it's too costly to put ventilation down in the mine. Well, who bears that cost? The workers bear that cost. Their families bear that cost. And it's generational, right? If you can't work, your kids are probably not going to higher education. They're probably going to be in the same boat as you were, with limited choices, where you're taking a more labor-intensive, dangerous occupation in order to support yourself. And those costs are generational. And when we did that chapter, and I was talking to the other miners' daughters and miners' sons and wives and stuff, the trauma really came through, and just like, oh my God, yeah, that happened to my dad too, and I didn't know that this was part of Parkinson's and that sort of thing. So it was very healing for me in many ways, because it's been a lot. I've carried a lot of these mine workers' stories and nowhere to put them, right? And being able to put that into a book and have something that will outlive me and outlive them, and hopefully engage people to say, we as a society cannot continue to injure and make sick and kill our workers. And we have to value their lives more than that. And I talk about the book, the fact that we've got special economic zones now and Bill 5s and things where we're just going to ram some things through. And there's no legislated guarantee that things that we take for granted, like the Occupational Health and Safety Act, that can be set aside under the Special Economic Zones Act. What do we, how are we protecting workers if we don't even have the basic rights in place because, well, we need this industry. Well, we need the workers to work in that industry to benefit all of us. We need to value their lives more than we value the cost that it's going to take to keep them safe and keep them healthy. That's it.
I mean, that's a really powerful place to end, but thank you very much for sharing your story, and I'm looking forward to the book.
Yeah, thank you.
And hopefully then we'll have another conversation about the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be great.
So, thanks so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Very much appreciate it.
You have been listening to Labor Pains, an Injured Worker podcast, produced by Injured Workers Community Legal Aid Clinic. Labor Pains is not a substitute for legal advice. For more information on workers' compensation issues, campaigns, and resources, visit InjuredWorkersOnline.org. As mentioned in the podcast, Janice Martell has launched a new voluntary registry open to all Ontario workers with a diagnosis of sarcoidosis. This is the first step in researching the relationship between work and this disease. Affected workers or next of kin can reach the registry by calling 1-705-822-3171.